Some people find God in nature. Others find him in prison. I found mine in a misplaced letter that stank of lavender and self-deception. The funny part? It wasn't addressed to me, and it sure as hell wasn't a letter anyone would want their husband cataloging alongside a 14th-century Venetian prayer book. I was alone in the museum archive on a damp Tuesday, the kind of gray afternoon that smells like wet stone and overdue regret. The restoration binder was old leather, stitched by hand, heavy with dust and dead mites, and inside, nestled like some decadent parasite, was a cream envelope with gold-embossed initials that matched my wife's. Elise. My Elise. Only it didn't say "to Martin" on the inside. It said, "to my wild blue fire." I read that line 5 times before I blinked. She hadn't even used quotation marks. Just a raw, throbbing declaration surrounded by hand-drawn waves and stars and, grotesquely, a cartoon of 2 stick figures holding hands inside what appeared to be a giant anatomical heart. I remember thinking, with some detached curiosity, that for a trained therapist, her drawing skills were insulting. But that wasn't the point. The point was, this had been hidden in my archive, my sacred space. I ran the museum's special collections, manuscripts people would pay 6 figures to sniff. Elise wasn't supposed to even be back here without clearance, let alone storing her poetic filth in the same folder as a 1397 papal letter. It felt like walking into a confessional and finding graffiti carved into the altar. I didn't say anything that night. She made baked halibut, overcooked it, and talked about the possibility of applying for an NEA grant with a brilliant new artist from Berlin. Her eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, like the lights you see when you stand up too fast. I watched her pour wine with the same hands that had drawn those little stick figures. Wild blue fire. What did that even mean? Was he a firefighter? A skydiver? Some painter who throws cobalt at canvases and calls it trauma work? Over the next few days, I tested her subtly. Brought up Berlin, watched her flinch. Mentioned the restoration room, saw the way her lips pursed, as if I'd brushed against something raw. One night, I made an offhand comment about the smell of lavender and turpentine. A lie, just a synthetic thought tossed into the air, and she knocked over her wine. I didn't ask her about the letter. Didn't confront her. Instead, I put it in a protective plastic sleeve, labeled it Artifact X, and logged it under Contemporary Emotional Folklore, unclassified. Then I slid it into drawer 43, behind the sealed writings of a 16th-century nun who claimed to receive love poems from angels. I went to work every day like normal. I cataloged, curated, smiled at donors. But inside, something had turned, a gear, a lever, a quiet old trapdoor creaking open. I'd been married to Elise for 15 years, and not once had she ever written me a love letter like that. Not once had she sketched me in any heart, let alone a wild one. No, for me it was always polite affection, functional companionship, the kind of love that dries slowly like varnish. But this letter? It had teeth. It had desire. And it wasn't for me. The next week, she asked me to review a proposal for a collaborative exhibition on post-trauma art and identity. It smelled suspiciously like a vehicle. A ferry. A beautifully designed ark meant to carry her and someone else somewhere new. I read it 3 times. I made no edits. I told her it was brilliant. Then I went back into the archives and started reading everything else she'd touched in the last 6 months. Elise was meticulous, but she wasn't a ghost. She left traces, notes, bookings, receipts. And in every breadcrumb, I saw a pattern forming. Not just betrayal. Intent. She hadn't tripped into this. She'd walked into it barefoot, smiling, leaving petals in her wake like some martyr of passion. But what she didn't know was that I'd spent my life in a world built on preservation. I was trained to detect fakes, to catch forgeries from the texture of ink. I could spot a counterfeit with one finger. So now, I'd treat her like one. I'd press her between glass. I'd log her, study her, learn her patterns. And then, piece by delicate piece, I would make her exhibit collapse. Not with rage. With curation. With timing. With elegance. The kind of destruction you don't notice until the entire structure sighs and folds quietly into ash. And that letter? That first crack? That was my opening piece. The first work in a private collection no one would ever see. But me. For a while, everything looked normal, better than normal, actually. Elise was radiant. That's the only way to describe it. She moved through the house like someone lit from within, like she'd discovered some secret current of energy that none of the rest of us could access. At first, I thought it was the vitamin D supplements. Then I thought maybe it was the kombucha she started brewing, filling the kitchen with those strange glass jars that looked like science experiments gone wrong. She was meditating more, doing yoga in the mornings with her laptop angled just out of view. She played music I didn't recognize, French jazz, ambient tribal loops, things that sounded more like atmospheres than melodies. And she smiled, constantly. But not at me. Not really. Her eyes would glaze right past mine and land somewhere else, somewhere inside herself, or worse, somewhere behind me. When I brought home flowers, she placed them in a vase on the guest room dresser. She used to set them on the dining table. When I made her tea in the evenings, she'd thank me with a voice that felt like it came from a script. Kind, sweet, rehearsed. One night, while brushing her hair, she told me she was thinking of exploring new forms of expression and needed creative solitude on weekends. I nodded like an idiot, thinking maybe it was menopause. Maybe this was what happened when a person transitioned into a new hormonal phase, except she wasn't more irritable or tired. She was giddy, glowing, euphoric in a way that didn't include me. She began staying later at work, citing meetings with a new European artist who wanted to revolutionize the intersection of trauma and expression. Her phone, once left on the counter charging, was suddenly always with her, face down. She changed her passcode, subtly, but I noticed. She said she wanted healthier boundaries with digital distractions. I almost believed her, until I walked past her office one afternoon and saw her quickly click away from a messaging app when I entered. The window had hearts in it. Not emojis, drawn hearts. The kind that only appear in digital ink when you're trying to prove sincerity through screens. She never used those with me. Not once. And yet I told myself this was normal. Growth. She was developing. She bought a new coat, an expensive one. She claimed it was for a retreat in Santa Fe, something about an art and silence workshop. But she packed heels for it. Elise hadn't worn heels in 3 years. I noticed the changes, cataloged them mentally, like I was assessing a damaged artifact, looking for microfractures, pressure points. I said nothing. One morning I found a credit card I didn't recognize, wedged between the couch cushions. I asked her about it. She smiled that dazzling, disorienting smile and told me it was part of a professional expense account for her nonprofit work. I'd never heard of this nonprofit before. She talked about it like I should have, as if we'd been discussing it for months. I nodded. She kissed my forehead like I was some confused uncle. Then she went back to typing on her tablet, never breaking eye contact with the screen. Her social media accounts went private around this time. I couldn't even see her posts anymore, not unless I asked. When I did, she said she was redefining her online presence. I told myself I respected that. Space is important. People evolve. But the cracks were there. In the way she hugged me, arms around my shoulders instead of my waist. In the way she stopped asking me to read her grant proposals. In the silence that grew between us during meals, filled only by chewing and the occasional polite cough. I still loved her. That's the sick part. I still believed that maybe this was a phase. Maybe she'd hit a creative streak and would burn through it, land back in my arms like a comet running out of sky. I even bought her a book on creative partnerships and marriage, left it on her nightstand. She moved it to her office and never mentioned it. One Sunday, while washing her car, a chore I did without asking, because I loved her, I found an empty champagne bottle rolled under the driver's seat. The expensive kind. View click what? We hadn't had champagne in months. I held it for a long time, trying to imagine a scenario in which it made sense. She didn't mention any celebrations. Said the retreat was quiet and emotionally deep. I put the bottle back exactly where I found it. Later that night, I watched her sleep. Her breathing was shallow, peaceful. She looked younger than she had in years. I reached out to touch her hand, and she pulled it away in her sleep like a reflex. Not in pain, just gone. Something was being rewritten. I could feel it. The life I thought we had was still there, but faded, like fresco beneath plaster. You could almost see the outline of it, the faint shape of what had once been vibrant. But it wasn't ours anymore. And still, I said nothing. Because hope is the last lie we tell ourselves before we start telling the truth. It was the sound that did it, soft, intimate, and out of place. Not words. A laugh. Hers. But not the kind she used with me, not the polite chuckle she gave after one of my dry historical anecdotes or the tight-lipped grin she reserved for museum donors who smelled like dust and ego. This was different. It was bright, open, reckless. And it was coming from her phone, echoing faintly through the cracked office door at home while she was in the shower. I had gone in to grab my notebook, nothing more. Her tablet was open on the desk, connected to her phone via speaker. Probably a mistake, probably something she thought she'd turned off. But the audio was live, broadcasting something she'd recorded, or maybe a live voice message. I froze the second I heard her laugh again, followed by a man's voice calling her Firebird. Then she said his name, Casper. Not Mr. Fisher, the artist. Not the collaborator. Casper. Just that. No hesitation. The name fell from her mouth like a well-worn stone. I didn't touch the tablet. I didn't pause the audio. I just stood there and listened as she told him she couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at her during the gallery preview in Barcelona. She said she still smelled the hotel sheets. Said she wanted to disappear into a world where no one knew her except him. And then, as if the gods wanted to drive the blade deeper, she repeated a line I had whispered to her just the week before, during one of our increasingly rare good nights. You make my soul feel seen. Except now, she whispered it to him. Slowly, intimately, like a spell. I didn't blink. I didn't even breathe. My body was utterly still, like a man who's just realized he's already been shot, but hasn't fallen yet. The water kept running in the bathroom. She had no idea, and I felt something inside me shift, quietly, like a hinge loosening on a cellar door that hadn't been opened in years. There was no anger, just clarity. Cold, clean clarity. I walked out, gently closed her office door behind me, and made tea. When she came out wrapped in a towel, humming some melody I didn't recognize, I asked her if she wanted honey in hers. She smiled and said yes, called me sweetheart. I handed it to her without looking her in the eye. That night, I lay awake next to her while she slept with her back turned, breathing evenly, as if she hadn't shattered something sacred just hours earlier. I didn't touch her, didn't cry, didn't ask questions, but something had died. The illusion, the story I'd told myself for months, that she was lost, that she was finding herself, that maybe she would come back. It was gone now. I knew exactly where she'd gone, knew who she was with, knew what she had said and how she had said it. And I knew something else, something even she didn't know yet. I was going to destroy her. Not violently, not publicly, but methodically, quietly, the way time ruins stone. I had spent my life preserving fragile things. Now I would unpreserve her, bit by bit. She had brought this into my world, into the place where I stored relics and meaning and beauty. She had spoken her betrayal into the air I breathed. And now, all that remained was to let the mask fully fall. She would go on smiling. She would keep lying. She would keep building her paper-thin fantasy with this Casper, this dilettante fire god in paint-stained jeans. But beneath that smile, the ground would begin to shift. I would loosen every bolt, twist every joint, feed her illusions until she choked on them. And when the house finally collapsed, she wouldn't even know who lit the match. Because I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't rage. I'd preserve the silence. Until the silence consumed everything. She had no idea how easy it would be to unravel her, how sloppily she'd covered her tracks, how much she'd come to believe in the neatness of her own deceptions. The first move was simple. I mirrored her phone. Not hacked. Mirrored. Elise, in her newfound wave of openness and spiritual security, had once asked me to help sync her iPad to our home Wi-Fi. What she didn't realize was that I quietly enabled iCloud backup on the old one she'd left buried in her desk. I left it there, untouched, collecting data like an archaeologist's time capsule. Every note, every shared calendar edit, every message she forgot to delete from the cloud filtered through. I didn't read them all. I filtered by key phrases: Casper, hotel, exhibit, funder. I discovered things she never intended to commit to writing. Appointment blocks labeled personal planning that lined up precisely with transactions at boutique hotels. Notes on European time zones and internal musings on navigating dual intimacy. What kind of person writes that down? A narcissist preparing a TED Talk. I started testing her lies gently, little chess pawns nudged forward. How was the donor brunch? I'd ask, knowing she'd never gone. Her eyes would flinch, not a blink, a micro flinch, and she'd say, inspiring. The same way a liar says, I love you, when they're mentally picturing someone else's face. I ordered flowers to her office, addressed from Martin, proud of you always. The front desk signed for them. That same afternoon, she texted me. Work's been chaotic, barely had time to breathe. No mention of the flowers. I called the florist and confirmed the bouquet was hand-delivered at noon. Move made. No response. Her friend Liza became the next angle. They weren't close, not really, but close enough that Elise trusted her for social cover. I created a burner Instagram, modeled after a mild-mannered art collector with interests in trauma studies and mid-century French sculpture. I followed Liza, liked 2 of her travel photos, then casually commented on a post about healing retreats in Andalusia. She replied. We exchanged harmless messages. Then I asked, thinking of attending that Santa Fe conference, do you know if Elise is going again this year? She replied, she hasn't been to Santa Fe in years, has she? I thanked her, then deleted the account. Data point confirmed. I examined our financials, not the obvious accounts, but the back end of her Venmo, the digital wallet we both used but never scrutinized. Dozens of small, precisely timed payments to Event Studio SF, Cafe Indigo, Rideshare Flex. Somewhere on days she told me she was working from home. Others lined up with messages from Casper's email signature, which I found referenced in a forwarded group email from a grant team she thought I wouldn't notice. I created a spreadsheet. Track dates. Correlated lies. This wasn't a single infidelity. It was a schedule. A routine. She had constructed a parallel existence, and like a seasoned curator, I laid it out in catalog form: columns, entries, tags. She once told me that curation was just storytelling with objects. Fitting. Now I was telling a story too, only this one ended with her entire exhibit burning from the inside. I planted trap questions like landmines. Should I contact Casper about the upcoming donor event? I heard his name mentioned. She froze. Too long. Then, oh, I don't think he's involved anymore. Lie. The very next day, I watched a message pop through her cloud calendar: Casper confirmed for donor dinner, 7 p.m. I watched her prep for it that evening like she was preparing for communion. She shaved, perfumed, changed earrings twice. I kissed her cheek before she left. She smiled and said, "You're always so calm, Martin." It's comforting. I nodded and said nothing. I didn't need to track her. I already knew the venue. I already knew what she would order, the kind of wine she'd pretend to enjoy, the affectations she'd adopt, pretending to be the pained artist's muse, the emotionally literate savior. I even knew the conversation topics. She recycled her stories endlessly, like all mediocre liars do. At home, I watched the time pass like a fisherman watches the tide. She returned at 11:04 p.m., the exact time I had predicted. Slight wine breath, slightly oversmiled, slightly too happy for a dinner she described as exhausting. I asked nothing. I listened. I let her weave the threads tighter. Because she wasn't just cheating. She was building a life where I was already a ghost, a shadow fading out of her frame. What she didn't know, what she would never see coming, was that the shadow had been watching. And soon, it would move. Not to scream, not to confront, but to erase. Strategically. Completely. And by the time she noticed, it would already be done. It happened in the one place she never expected it, her own curated temple, the museum's main hall, midweek, during the closing hour of a private donor tour. The place was mostly empty except for a few interns packing up flyers and a janitor sweeping behind the Greco-Roman exhibit. I had reserved the final hour under the guise of a confidential donor walkthrough, something she'd normally take point on, but this time, I insisted on guiding it myself. I told her to meet me there for a post-event debrief. She arrived in a silk blouse I'd never seen before, her hairstyle just slightly more dramatically than usual, a faint scent of jasmine and something sharper trailing behind her. She smiled like we were playing dress-up in our old lives. I led her into the side gallery, the one with the large LCD installation wall used for rotating digital projections, usually abstract art, archived data, or donation impact loops. But tonight, it had a new exhibit I called Contemporary Correspondence. She didn't notice anything wrong at first. The lights were low, elegant, familiar. She was in control, or thought she was. I offered her a glass of the Bordeaux she used to love, and we stood in the middle of the room, alone, surrounded by screens. Then I clicked a remote in my pocket, and the wall came alive. First, an image, her and Casper, sitting close at a rooftop bar in Lisbon, her hand resting on his thigh, her lips mid-laugh, his gaze locked on her like she was the only sound in the world. She blinked, smiled, then tilted her head. "What is this?" she asked, voice light, uncertain. I didn't speak. Another image appeared, her, in a hotel lobby in Prague, kissing him openly, carelessly, like no one had ever taught her discretion. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, too quickly. Her voice cracked slightly, and she stepped forward, as if proximity could blur the resolution. "It's just, we were collaborating, and things got emotionally intense. It was messy, okay? But not ongoing. That was a while ago. I still said nothing. The next screen showed a log of flight bookings, each timestamped under a shared frequent flyer account she had once used for grant travel. The lie crumbled in her posture. Then came the voice memos, her words, her voice, laughing, panting, whispering dreams into Casper's voicemail. I feel like I'm being reborn. I've never been so alive. I can't wait to be out of that house and into this world with you. She turned sharply toward me. You were spying on me? Seriously? That's your takeaway? You invaded my privacy? You had no right. I raised a hand, slow and calm. She fell silent. You spoke those words into a cloud you never bothered to secure, I said. I simply listened. Her eyes darted, searching for something. Dignity, maybe, or a loophole in the facts. You ignored me for years, she snapped, the pitch rising. Do you even remember the last time you asked me what I wanted? You sleepwalked through our life while I bled for meaning. I needed something real. I nodded slowly. And you found it, in a man who lists creative burning as a profession and who still can't spell Nietzsche after quoting him twice in one email. Her mouth opened, then shut. The mockery had been clean, clinical. She laughed suddenly, bitter and performative. You think you've won something here? You don't get points for catching someone you pushed away. You're a relic, Martin, stuck in a world of dead letters and brittle paper. Casper is alive. He sees me. I looked at her and felt nothing but a quiet, heavy emptiness, like the silence of a library long after closing. Then why, I asked softly, does he still share a one-bedroom loft with 2 other men and owe back taxes in 3 countries? Her expression cracked, just briefly. I saw fear edge in behind the glass of her performance. You looked him up? She whispered. I said no. I studied him. She took a step back. Her eyes flicked toward the exit. Her confidence had splintered, but she wasn't done yet. What now? She asked. You gonna destroy me in front of the board? Send this to my clients? Make some public scene? I shook my head. You don't understand, Elise. This isn't a scene. This is a restoration. Of truth. Of balance. And I'm not interested in humiliating you. That would be too loud. She laughed again, but it was hollow now, thinner, tinged with tremble. Then what are you doing? She asked. I stepped closer. I'm just beginning. Her face paled. For the first time, the air between us held no roles, no masks, just the pure tension of 2 people who knew that everything that once connected them had been cut, methodically, and one of them was still pretending not to feel it. We stood there, beneath the soft glow of the screens, surrounded by her own history, her own undoing, and I watched her start to understand. Not what I knew, but what I was capable of. And I didn't move. Not yet. Because the real silence hadn't even begun. She started pacing before I even turned the screen off, her heels clicking across the gallery floor like nails tapping glass. And when I finally looked up from the empty wine glass in my hand, her face had shifted. No more poise, no practiced elegance, just raw, twitching instability hiding behind cheap mascara and borrowed rage. You don't get to do this, she spat. You don't get to act like some martyr just because I found something outside the museum tomb you call a life. I said nothing. She waited, eyes burning, hoping to ignite something in me, a reaction, a spark, even a flinch. But I didn't offer her even that. You smothered me, Martin, she snapped. With your perfect routines and your dead languages and your endless trivia about forgotten art nobody cares about anymore. I needed air. I needed life. Still nothing. Her lips curled. God, look at you. Still standing there like some statue. You want to know the real reason I did it? Because you were boring. You were safe. And not the kind of safe that makes a woman feel protected, the kind that makes her feel dead. My gaze didn't move. Her voice cracked higher. You think you can shame me with a slideshow? You think this is some intellectual punishment, like you're grading my morals on a rubric? Her laugh was jagged, wild. You were never enough for me, Martin. Not emotionally, not physically, not as a man. You're a museum piece with a pulse. I finally spoke, softly. And yet you stayed for 15 years. She flinched. Just for a second. Because I pitied you, she said, eyes narrowing. Because I knew you'd fall apart without me. You need structure, control, someone to keep you from collapsing into your little rituals. Casper, he let me breathe. I stepped forward just slightly, letting the silence carry weight. Casper thinks Caravaggio is a cocktail. She blinked. I saw the edge of her mask falter. Don't, she whispered. Don't try to belittle him just because he isn't your type. I raised a brow. He lives off microgrants and borrowed couches. That's not a type. That's a cautionary tale. Her eyes filled, not with sorrow but with pure frustration, the kind that comes when manipulation fails and the target doesn't collapse like expected. Why won't you say something real? Scream at me. Hate me. Do something. I tilted my head. Why? I asked, voice low. Would that make it easier for you? She looked away, suddenly unsure, suddenly smaller. This didn't have to happen like this, she muttered. If you'd just seen me. If you'd tried to reach me sooner instead of hiding in your archives and spreadsheets, I cut her off. You stopped being reachable the moment you started rehearsing your excuses. Her mouth opened, but nothing came. She stepped back, as if needing space from the weight of her own unraveling. You don't even care, do you? She whispered. I'm telling you everything, and you're just cold. I gave her a slow nod. Yes. That single word seemed to pierce deeper than any tirade. You should care, she snapped. You should be devastated. I met her eyes for the first time in minutes. Oh, I was. Quietly. While you were composing voice memos in hotel rooms. But grief ends. And now? Now I'm just observing a performance. She stepped forward again, her tone suddenly saccharine, syrupy. Martin, we can fix this. People make mistakes. They act out when they feel neglected. We could try counseling. I'll end it. You and I, we were real. I looked at her like I might look at a cracked painting, once beautiful, now beyond restoration. You ended it, I said, when you started keeping score. The mask finally shattered. You're impossible, she shouted, eyes wet, voice breaking. You don't feel anything. You just sit in your tower judging the world through books and relics and fragments. I let the accusation hang there, then replied with a slow breath. No, I just don't feel anything for you anymore. Her shoulders dropped. The room grew still. Even her breath seemed to falter. And in that silence, she knew. It was over. Not because I had screamed, or threatened, or broken down, but because I hadn't. Because the part of me that had once waited by the door, hoping for her to come back to me whole, was now ash. And she could see it. That scared her more than anything she'd ever said. Because rage can be fought. Love can be earned. But indifference? Indifference is exile. And I had already left the country. The beauty of revenge is in the rhythm. Slow, precise, unannounced. I didn't rage, I didn't threaten, and I didn't play the part of the wounded man. I played the archivist, the planner, the strategist. First came the quiet purge. Every digital account we shared, utilities, streaming, travel points, even the shared calendar app, we no longer shared. I moved into private domains, updated passwords, and disabled all recovery links she had access to. Joint accounts were severed methodically. The lawyer I retained specialized in high-discretion asset protection. We'd met 2 weeks before the gallery confrontation, over espresso and spreadsheets. I showed her the paper trail, proof of Elise's redirected travel expenses, her misrepresentation of nonprofit activity, her conversations about using museum contacts to funnel influence. The lawyer's eyebrows didn't move. She just nodded and began drafting. I wasn't divorcing her, not yet. That would come last. What I needed first was leverage. Elise's job, ironically, was her Achilles heel. Her therapy credentials required annual ethics reviews. Her donor-facing position required reputation control. And her upcoming grant, a 6-figure, publicly funded one, was bound by a code of fiduciary transparency. I gathered everything. Every voice memo, every message, every hotel receipt tied to business funds. I created a timeline, an annotated dossier, and a curated index with cross-references. The same way I catalog manuscripts. I sent one version anonymously to the board chair of the museum, another to the ethics liaison of her therapy license board. No accusations, just documents, chronology, proof. I didn't have to say a word. Her actions spoke in high definition. Meanwhile, I pulled all financial authorizations connected to our shared cards and corporate perks. The vehicle she drove, mine. The car loan was always in my name. I contacted the dealer, had it picked up for routine service, and it never returned. Her health insurance, tied to my policy, terminated under spousal clause adjustment. Her name vanished from emergency contacts, mailing addresses, and tax pre-file notifications. She didn't notice immediately. That was the point. I let her drift for a few days in that bubble of post-confrontation delusion, still thinking she had options. Still thinking she could spin it into something poetic and survivable. I called her father, not to gossip, just to inform. I told him, with clinical precision, what she had done, what I had uncovered, and that I would not be covering for her anymore. He listened in silence, then said quietly, "She always did think she was the smartest in the room." I thanked him for his time and hung up. Then came the career unraveling. She had planned a launch for her art therapy nonprofit, scheduled to align with a museum grant. She'd already printed materials, hired a PR intern, and scheduled interviews. What she didn't know was that I had alerted the funding committee to a discrepancy in her proposal timeline, a travel voucher listed for educational collaboration in Lisbon, which coincided exactly with her romantic getaway. The committee, upon reviewing the flight logs and travel receipts I provided, quietly froze her grant. No announcements, just cancellation, delay, silence. A month later, her launch came and went. No funding, no media, no donors. Casper, I'm told, moved on to someone else. He was never going to stay. He's a man of moments, not aftermaths. I also retained quiet influence with 3 major donors she'd courted for months. I shared the dossier with one of them, a retired judge who dislikes dishonesty and once donated a bronze sculpture in my name. He rescinded his pledge. Another followed suit. Her name began to erode in the whisper net of cultural funding, where no one yells but everyone remembers. At home, she tried to fight back. Emails, voicemails. Let's talk. Let's heal. Let's work through this. I responded once. We are not broken. We are finished. She sent flowers to my office, white lilies, like a funeral. I left them in the museum lobby with a sign, unclaimed. Then came the final act. I served her the divorce papers at a gallery fundraiser, handed discreetly by a process server dressed as a sommelier. She opened the envelope while sipping rose beside a sculpture of 2 hands pulling apart. She didn't look for me. She knew I was there, watching. Not to humiliate her, but to end her, gently, like turning off a lamp. That's how you dismantle a liar. Not with rage. With evidence. With patience. With silence. And by the time she realized she was sinking, the water had already filled her lungs. The gala was Elise's idea, a last-ditch effort to reassert relevance, to show the community she was still the voice of progressive art, still the beacon of intellectual grace, still unfazed. She called it a celebration of expressive recovery, though the irony was thick enough to coat the marble floors. She wore a velvet gown in a deep burgundy shade I hadn't seen before, her hair pulled back tight, cheekbones carved for deflection. I arrived late on purpose. Let her think she had the room. Let her think, just for one more hour, that her world was still hers. The gallery space was lit like a cathedral, soft uplighting on glass sculptures, murmurs of cultured laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Her voice carried across the room as she recited something about art as honesty to a semicircle of bored patrons. But I wasn't there for the speech. I was there for the unveiling. She didn't know that every person in that room, donors, artists, faculty, board members, had received a packet earlier that day. Some by email, some by courier. Each contained a curated set of images, time logs, and voice memos that contradicted her ethics declarations, her funding justifications, and her so-called emotional narrative. They were titled simply, Discrepancies in Transparency. No accusations. No slander. Just facts. Numbers. Her voice whispering to Casper about reallocating the museum's brand to fund our story. A hotel receipt charged to a museum grant. Her signature next to Lies. When she stepped up to the microphone to welcome everyone, she didn't yet know they all knew. Her smile was the smile of a woman mid-ballet, convinced she still has the spotlight. Thank you for coming, she began. It's so meaningful to share space with those who believe in truth. And then she saw the faces. Not angry. Just blank. Cold. One donor crossed his arms. Another turned to whisper to his wife. A third checked her phone, reading something Elise didn't have access to yet. Her voice faltered. She blinked. And, in times like these, it's vital we hold space for the messy, the raw, the vulnerable. Her throat caught. She cleared it too late. Someone coughed. From the back of the room, I stood, arms folded. She saw me, and for a second, her face did something involuntary, twitched, contracted, like a painting exposed to too much light. She continued speaking, but her sentences frayed at the edges. Words like transformative and intersectional intimacy came out dull, practiced, lifeless. Then, one of the board members stepped out quietly. 2 more followed. Casper was not there, of course not. He had disappeared a week earlier, ghosting her after realizing the grant money was frozen and her status was under review. No art shows. No apartment escape. No new life. Just Elise. Alone, clinging to the illusion. Her eyes began scanning the room faster now, looking for a safe face, a hand to grab. None came. Even her assistant, the one who used to worship her, stood stone still beside the hors d'oeuvres table, face unreadable. I stayed where I was. Didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched. She tried a joke, something about artist breakdowns being part of the process, but her voice cracked, and the laugh came out brittle. No one laughed with her. Her smile broke, just for a moment, but visibly. A tremble in the lips, a shimmer in the eyes. And then it all began to collapse. Her breathing quickened, her posture slackened, her words fell into ramble. She apologized for things she hadn't mentioned. She brought up contextual misunderstanding. She said, some things have been taken out of proportion, though no one had said a word yet. That's the thing about exposure. It doesn't need an audience's reaction to be fatal. Silence is sharper than shame. By the time she finally stopped speaking, there was no applause. Just the slow, echoing pull of her own collapse. And I was still there. Still watching. She met my gaze across the room and saw it. No rage, no satisfaction, just finality. The quiet of a man who has already packed her story into a sealed drawer and labeled it irrelevant. She turned toward the exit, but no one followed. No one reached for her. She walked out of the room with the desperate dignity of someone hoping to wake from a nightmare. But she wasn't dreaming. This was real. And I stayed until the lights dimmed, until the staff started folding chairs, until even the echoes stopped echoing. Because I wanted her to know that the last person to leave was the man she tried to erase, and that he never even had to raise his voice. It was supposed to be a farewell dinner, her idea, naturally framed as a closure meal for select friends and family before she stepped into the next phase of her journey, as she called it. I knew what she was really doing, staging a redemption arc, setting the scene where she could weep with charm, where her audience could pat her hand and say, "You're so brave." I almost didn't go. But then I thought, no, let's finish this where it began, around a table, pretending. The restaurant was upscale but modest, that curated intimacy designed for big feelings and expensive entrees. Her parents were there, looking hollowed out but determined to play along. My sister sat to my left, arms crossed, not touching her wine. Elise entered late, dramatic as ever, in a slate gray dress and too much eyeliner, the kind she used to apply when she wanted to look tragic. She kissed her mother, gave her father a squeeze, then turned to me with that same empty smile. "Martin," she said, "thank you for being here. It means more than you know." I stood up, and for a second, she must have thought I was going to toast. I didn't. I pulled a folded stack of papers from my coat pocket, copies of her grant fraud timeline, the letter from her licensing board, and screenshots of Casper's messages after she asked him to lie for her. I handed them to her father, who began reading immediately. "What is this?" Elise said, voice cracking. "Martin, what are you doing?" I turned to the table. "You wanted honesty tonight. That's what we're having." Her face drained as her father's eyes widened, his lips tightening. "Is this true?" he asked her. "Did you lie on federal forms?" She reached for the papers, panicked now. No, this is all being taken out of context. He's twisting everything." My sister leaned forward. "These are screenshots, Elise. Either you wrote them, or you didn't." Elise slammed her hand on the table. "This isn't fair. You're all letting him control the story like he's some innocent monk. He neglected me for years, he made me feel invisible, and I found love somewhere else. Yes. But don't you dare pretend he's a saint." Gasps around the table. Her mother looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "Love," I said, finally. "Is that what you call hopping city to city on someone else's dime while whispering your soul into a man who couldn't even stick around long enough to meet you for dessert?" She shot to her feet. "You don't understand what it's like to suffocate, to be married to a man who sees the world through parchment and footnotes. You catalog feelings, Martin. You don't feel them." My voice rose, but never lost control. "No, Elise. I felt everything. I felt you drift. I felt you lie. I felt every second of silence when you said you were finding yourself, and what you were really finding was a new place to be worshipped. You wanted to be a goddess, and you picked a temple built out of someone else's trust." A waiter appeared nervously at the edge of the table. "Is everything all right?" "No," my sister snapped. "But it's about to be over." Elise turned to her friends, desperate now. "You've known me for years. He's spinning this." I was in pain. I was trying to heal. One friend stood up. "You told me you were traveling for grief therapy." not hotel rendezvous. You lied to me too. Someone across the restaurant started filming. Elise noticed and snarled. Really? You're going to record this like it's entertainment? I looked into the lens. Let them. It's finally the truth. Her voice cracked. You're enjoying this. No, I said. This is grief in reverse. Watching someone dig their own grave and still hand them the shovel. She lunged toward me, finger jabbing the air. You killed us, Martin. With your silence, with your coldness, with your pathetic pride. I leaned in, voice low. No, I let you kill yourself. I just made sure there was light when you did it, so everyone could see. She froze. Her breath caught. Her eyes flicked from face to face, each one turned, hardened, disbelieving. Her mother was crying now. Her father refused to look at her. The only sound was the soft recording click of a stranger's phone. And then, for the first time, she truly broke. No more words. Just trembling hands, shallow breath, and a collapse back into her chair like the weight of her own lies had finally come crashing down. I buttoned my coat, nodded once to the table, and walked out. Not because I was running, but because the sentence had been served, and there was nothing left to say. She moved 3 times in 6 months, each place smaller than the last, trading high ceilings and curated rugs for beige carpet and single-paned windows that never closed right. The museum quietly terminated her contract after the licensing board suspended her credentials pending review, though everyone already knew what that meant. Her name vanished from every grant, every event roster, every gallery placard. The website she built for her nonprofit dissolved, domain expired, not renewed. Her last PR intern deleted all mentions of her from LinkedIn. Friends who used to post filtered selfies at her brunches stopped responding altogether. One even blocked her number after Elise left 5 voicemails in a single night. Her parents told her they needed distance, and that the damage she caused to their name professionally, socially was irreconcilable. Casper? He fled the moment the money dried up and the invites disappeared. Last I heard, he was doing a live painting series in Tucson, tagging blurry nudes under Freedom Process. She sent me a letter on my birthday, handwritten, shaky script, tear-stained in that obvious, theatrical way she used to fake when she was trying to appear raw. Said she missed my voice in the mornings, the quiet safety of our life, the way I always left the light on in the hallway for her. Said, I still love you. I didn't reply. A month later, she showed up at my door. Her makeup was smudged, hair thinner, wearing a coat that didn't match the season. She stood on the porch like someone who wasn't sure how to stand anymore, arms tight around herself, looking past me like maybe if she didn't meet my eyes she could keep the memory intact. Martin, she whispered, please, just talk to me. I don't even want forgiveness, I need to hear you say something. Anything. I don't know who I am anymore. I looked at her for a long, still moment. Then I said, that makes 2 of us. And I closed the door. No anger. No explanation. Just a lock turning behind her. Because the woman on that porch wasn't my wife. She hadn't been for a long time. She was just a ruin in borrowed skin, a ghost who burned down her own house and then knocked on mine asking for a match. I went back to my tea, put on a record, and never opened another letter from her again. The last message she ever sent said, do you even remember my voice? I replied once, and only once. Strange. I don't even remember your name anymore. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a long one, but maybe you saw something in it that made you think. I'd love to know where you're listening from and whether you'd want to hear another. Let me know.